Welcome to our new episode.
The Vikings' Hidden America Connection. History tells us that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But what if that story isn't the whole truth? What if, nearly 5 centuries earlier, another people, fierce, fearless, and far ahead of their time, had already crossed the Atlantic? They came not with crowns or crosses, but with axes, longships, and a hunger for the unknown. They were the Vikings, and their lost journey to America may be the greatest untold story in history. Minnesota, 1898. A farmer named Olaf Oman was clearing trees on his land when his axe struck something solid. Digging through the dirt, he uncovered a strange gray stone covered in ancient letters, runes, the writing of the Old Norse people. The inscription read, 8 Gotlanders and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland westward. We had a camp by 2 skerries, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were fishing one day. After we came home, we found 10 men red with blood and dead. At the bottom, a date, 1362. It was called the Kensington Runestone, and it shook American archaeology to its core. If genuine, it meant that Norse explorers had not only reached America in the 14th century, they had traveled deep into its heart, more than 1,000 miles inland. Experts were divided. Some called it a clever fake. Others said no hoaxer could have carved such authentic runes in the 1800s. But one question echoed louder than any argument. Why would a Swedish farmer in rural Minnesota invent a story that would make him a global target of ridicule? To find the answer, we must sail back nearly 1,000 years, to the time when the world was smaller and yet far larger than anyone could imagine. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 AD, a time when the world trembled at the sound of longships slicing through the fog. The Norsemen of Scandinavia, from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, were not just raiders, they were explorers, craftsmen, poets, and traders. Their ships reached Iceland, Greenland, and even the edge of North America centuries before any European king ever dreamed of the New World. At the center of this story stands one family, Eric the Red, his fiery temper, and his son, Leif Erikson, destined to change history. Eric was exiled from Norway for murder, then from Iceland again for the same crime. But exile to a Viking was not the end, it was a beginning. He sailed west into the mists and found a vast frozen land, barren yet alive with potential. He named it Greenland, hoping the name would attract settlers. It worked. By the year 986, hundreds of Norse families had established farms along Greenland's coast, pushing human survival to its limits. They built turf houses, tended sheep, and worshipped both Norse gods and the new Christian faith spreading through Europe. And among them grew young Leif Erikson, hearing stories of strange lands to the west, lands filled with trees, rivers, and warmth. Around the year 999, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson set sail from Iceland to visit his father in Greenland. Caught in a violent storm, he drifted far off course and sighted unknown lands covered in forests. He never set foot there, but when he returned, his tale spread across the settlements like wildfire. Leif Erikson listened carefully. If Bjarni's story was true, then there were habitable lands beyond Greenland, untouched and waiting. In 1000 AD, Leif bought Bjarni's ship, gathered 35 men, and set sail toward the mystery. Their long ship cut through the freezing Atlantic, guided only by stars, the sun, and the instincts of seafarers born for danger. Weeks passed. Then on the horizon, land appeared, rocky and gray. Life called it Helluland, flat stone land, likely modern-day Baffin Island. They sailed south and found a place of endless forests, markland or forestland, perhaps Labrador. Still, life pressed on, until one day they found paradise. It was a mild, fertile region filled with wild grapes, fish, and game. The Norse marveled at how warm it felt, how the sun lingered longer, and how easy life could be. They built shelters, named rivers, and explored the coastline. They called this place Vinland, the land of wine. The exact location of Vinland remains debated. Some say Newfoundland, others Nova Scotia, or even Maine. But one thing is certain. The Vikings had crossed the Atlantic and reached North America nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. For one glorious season, Life and his crew thrived there. They filled their ships with grapes and timber, proof of their discovery, and sailed back to Greenland. Their leader, Eric the Red, had died, but Life had done something no one else dared. He had redrawn the map of the world. Life's tales spread across the Norse colonies, and soon more expeditions followed. His brother, Thorvald Eriksson, led a second voyage. They explored farther, setting up camps along the coast. But one morning, they encountered strange figures, dark-skinned men with bows, the Skraelings, ancestors of today's indigenous peoples. The encounter turned deadly. Thorvald was struck by an arrow and buried beneath a cross on a hill by the sea, the first European grave in America. Yet even that did not end the dream. Another adventurer, Thorkarfinn Kalsefin, gathered 160 settlers, including women, cattle, and children, and set out to build a permanent colony. For 3 years they lived in Vinland, farming and trading with the natives. A child was born there, Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European born on American soil. But tensions with the Skraelings grew violent. The settlers, outnumbered and isolated, eventually abandoned the colony and sailed home. Vinland faded into legend, but not before changing human history. For centuries, the sagas of Vinland survived only in Icelandic manuscripts, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. To most scholars, they sounded like heroic myths, not history. Then, in 1960, something extraordinary happened. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, archaeologists Helge Instad and Anstein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement, Lands I Meadows. The evidence was undeniable. Norse-style longhouses, iron nails, a bronze pin from a cloak, and carbon dating that matched the year 1000 AD. For the first time, the sagas were proven true. The Vikings had indeed reached North America. But for every question answered, new mysteries emerged. How far did they go? Did they return? And what of that strange stone found centuries later in Minnesota, carved with runes of blood and death? The Kensington runestone, Lands I Meadows, and scattered Norse artifacts across the continent began to tell a larger story, one that suggested the Vikings' reach went far beyond what textbooks claimed. Some scholars argue that later expeditions, possibly in the 1300s, continued to explore America's rivers, hunting and mapping deep inland. Others believe survivors of Vinland may have intermingled with indigenous tribes, their descendants lost in the tapestry of early North America. If so, the roots of European presence in America run deeper and far stranger than anyone imagined. Centuries before Columbus, men from the far north sailed wooden ships across an unforgiving ocean. They left behind stories, bones, and runes carved in stone, whispers of a forgotten chapter in the story of America. And perhaps the Vikings never truly left.
By the time Leif Erikson's sails vanished on the horizon, the Norse world had changed. Greenland had become a lonely outpost, a fragile bridge between the Old World and a continent no one yet understood. But the story of the Vikings in America didn't end with Leif. It only drifted into silence, buried under snow, myth, and time. For centuries, two Icelandic sagas whispered of Vinland, the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders. They told of exploration, conflict, and a land so rich that milk overflowed and salmon filled the rivers. When European scholars first read these in the 1800s, most dismissed them as legend. Yet the descriptions of coastlines, seasons, and daylight hours matched real geography with uncanny precision. It was as if the writers had been there. One line from the saga of the Greenlanders stands out. From there they sailed south for 2 days and found a river that flowed from a lake. They called the place Straumfjord. That single sentence sparked modern quests. Where was Straumfjord? Some claimed it was Newfoundland. Others argued it was somewhere far south, maybe Nova Scotia, even Cape Cod. Every answer opened another door. Archaeology proved that Norsemen reached Newfoundland. But what about the years after 10,000 AD? No records in Europe mention further crossings, yet hints kept surfacing in unexpected places. In the 14th century, the Greenland Norse traded ivory and walrus hides with Norway. But Greenland's population was dwindling. Their last written contact with Europe dates to the early 1400s. Then, nothing. A civilization vanished. One theory suggests that famine and climate change pushed small bands westward again, toward richer hunting grounds rumored to lie beyond the ice. If they did, they would have followed the same currents that carried Leif Erikson, perhaps reaching the Canadian mainland, even drifting down river systems that slice deep into the continent. The Kensington runestone sits inside a museum today, polished and protected behind glass. But in its letters, carved deep into gray granite, some see the echo of a lost expedition. Supporters claim the inscription's language bridges medieval Norwegian and Swedish dialects that match the 1300s. Skeptics argue that Olaf Omen, the farmer who found it, simply carved it himself. Yet curious details persist. The spelling of words, the weathering of the runes, and phrases unknown to 19th century linguists. More strangely, a handful of other stones with Norse runes have turned up across North America, in Oklahoma, South Dakota, even Maine. Most are fakes. A few defy easy classification. If even one were genuine, it would rewrite history. But archaeology demands evidence, not coincidence. So researchers looked north again, searching for physical traces beyond Newfoundland. In the 1960s, while Lanz Almedos confirmed the Norse arrival, small finds elsewhere deepened the riddle. A silver Viking penny minted under King Olaf Kyrre, 1065 to 1080, surfaced in an indigenous archaeological site in Maine. The penny's presence so far south baffled experts. Trade item, lost collector's piece, or relic of a forgotten journey? In Ellesmere Island, wooden artifacts built with iron nails, rare among native tools, hinted at contact with Greenland Norse hunters. On Baffin Island, fibers spun with Old World techniques appeared in digs dating between the 11th and 13th centuries. Individually, Each find could be explained away. Together, they painted a quiet picture. The Vikings might have roamed the Canadian Arctic for centuries, hunting, trading, intermarrying, adapting. If they moved south along the rivers, the idea of Norsemen reaching the North American interior suddenly seemed less impossible. To understand why they may have gone, one must see what was happening at home. By 1200 AD, Greenland's climate was turning colder, the start of the Little Ice Age. Sea ice choked harbors, pastures withered, and trade ships stopped coming. The last bishop of Greenland died around 1378. By 1410, the final written record describes a wedding, then silence. Starving farmers may have packed their few possessions, followed walrus migrations west, and vanished into the wilderness. To later Europeans, Greenland simply disappeared. But perhaps some survivors found a way out by going farther west, into Vinland's remembered lands. If so, the Kensington runestone's 1362 date suddenly fits the timeline perfectly. Imagine the journey. A small band of Norsemen leaves a collapsing Greenland colony. They follow ice floes across Davis Strait, then paddle down the rivers of Labrador. Months later, they reach forests filled with unfamiliar animals and endless freshwater lakes, the heart of North America. There they carve a memorial to fallen comrades. They expect rescue that never comes. Centuries later, farmers dig it up and call it myth. Far to the east, in Rhode Island, a round stone tower stands in Toro Park. Colonial records from the 1600s call it the Old Stone Mill, but some insist it's far older. Its arches resemble medieval churches of Northern Europe. Some even claim its proportions match Norse architecture found in Greenland. No definitive proof ties it to Vikings, yet its mystery endures. Similarly, inscriptions and artifacts across New England, from a supposed Norse sword hilt to iron nails embedded in ancient layers, keep surfacing, each stirring debate between believers and skeptics. Historians urge caution. The human mind loves patterns, and America's colonial past is littered with imported relics. But the persistence of these discoveries suggests something deeper, a cultural longing to connect the New World to a more ancient one. Modern science has joined the chase. Satellite imagery now scans coastlines once unreachable, mapping soil disturbances that could indicate buried Norse structures. Archaeologists use magnetometers to detect traces of hearths and ironwork. In 2016, researchers announced evidence of a second possible Viking site at Point Rosé, Newfoundland. For a moment, headlines blazed, "New Viking settlement found in North America." But later excavations proved inconclusive. The site showed human activity, yet no clear Norse artifacts. Even so, the search continues in Labrador, Baffin Island, and northern Maine. Every spadeful of earth has the potential to overturn centuries of accepted history. Academia remains divided. Mainstream historians accept Lonsal Meadows as proof of one Norse outpost, a temporary base for exploration and resource gathering. They reject inland or southern settlements as lacking evidence. But a smaller circle of researchers, geologists, linguists, and amateur historians, note that the record is incomplete. They note how many medieval voyages were lost to storms, how fragile Norse parchment was, how easily an entire chapter of exploration could vanish without trace. As one archaeologist put it, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the evidence may still lie under a Canadian bog. The debate has become more than academic. It's philosophical. Who gets to decide what counts as history and what remains myth? To the indigenous peoples of the Arctic and Atlantic coasts, stories of pale-faced strangers long predate Columbus. Inuit oral histories speak of the Kaldunayat, foreigners with strange boats, iron knives, and cloth sails. Some tales describe trading and peaceful meetings. Others recall sudden violence. For centuries, scholars ignored these as folklore. Now anthropologists revisit them as possible memories of Norse contact. If those encounters happened, they weren't one-time events. They might have spanned generations, shaping both sides in subtle ways. Imagine a child of mixed ancestry born in a remote camp around 1300 AD, half Inuit, half Norse, speaking two languages, carrying two worlds in one body. That child's descendants could
have walked the tundra for centuries, their origin story fading into legend. In 2021, core samples from Greenland's ice revealed traces of lead and soot, signs of medieval metallurgy long after the colony supposedly vanished. Someone was still working iron there, maybe into the 1400s. Meanwhile, deep-ground radar over northern Newfoundland detected rectangular soil signatures, shapes eerily similar to Viking longhouses. The discoveries remain under study, but they feed a growing sense that history is larger than the textbooks ever allowed. Why does the idea of Vikings in America before Columbus fascinate people so deeply? Because it challenges a comfortable story. It says exploration wasn't a single European triumph, but a complex web of forgotten attempts, failures, and survivals. It reminds us that discovery is rarely about being first. It's about being remembered. And for centuries, the Norse in America were not. A 15th century map known as the Vinland map surfaced in the 1950s, showing parts of North America labeled Vinlanda Insula. At first hailed as revolutionary, it was later called a forgery after chemical tests found modern ink compounds. Yet some experts still defend it, arguing the tests were flawed. Whether real or fake, the Vinland map mirrors a truth. By the 1400s, whispers of Western lands had already reached European ears. Columbus himself owned books describing the islands of the West. Perhaps those whispers began with North sailors who never returned, but whose stories drifted home on the tide. From stone towers to silver pennies, from sagas to satellite scans, every clue adds another thread to an unfinished tapestry. We may never prove that Vikings carved the Kensington runestone or built the Newport Tower, but we can prove that they possessed the skill, ships, and courage to reach any shore the Atlantic could hide. And maybe that's enough to reopen the case. Across oceans and centuries, the trail of the Vikings fades in and out like a ghost ship on the horizon. We have their sagas, their ruins, their bones, and questions that refuse to die. If they reach deeper into America, the evidence still waits beneath forests and fields, biding its time.
The story of the Vikings in America might have ended in blood and mystery, but their presence didn't vanish completely. Fragments of their journey, tiny clues scattered across the continent, continued to whisper their story through time. While most of the Norse settlements eventually disappeared under layers of soil and history, their fingerprints may still live on in ways historians are only now beginning to understand. In 1957, in Massachusetts, a farmer discovered a weathered stone buried near a riverbank. On it were faint carvings, lines and curves that resembled Norse runes. Scholars debated whether it was genuine or just a natural formation, yet the style matched inscriptions found in Scandinavia during the 11th century. Similar finds appeared elsewhere: Minnesota's Heavener rune stone, Oklahoma's Koto stone, and the famous Kensington rune stone unearthed in 1898. While many academics dismissed these as hoaxes, others found small details, linguistic forms, carving depth, tool marks that seemed remarkably authentic. It's easy to understand the skepticism. History has seen countless fabricated relics made to sell newspapers or attract tourists. But some of these stones predate modern tools, and carbon analysis on the lichen covering their surfaces suggests incredible age. Could it be that scattered Norse explorers left markers of their journey deeper into the American heartland? If true, it means the Vikings might have traveled thousands of miles inland, sailing up rivers, crossing forests, and mapping a land no European was supposed to see for another 5 centuries. The Icelandic sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, tell vivid stories of Vinland. But buried in old manuscripts are smaller fragments, rarely discussed, tales of voyages beyond Vinland, of lands rich in grapes and wild wheat, of mountains that smoke and shake. To some historians, these references sound eerily like descriptions of regions far south of Newfoundland, possibly the Gulf of St. Lawrence or even New England. One obscure passage mentions a river wide and deep with red sand at its mouth. Modern researchers have pointed to rivers like the St. Lawrence or even the Hudson, both matching those descriptions closely. Another saga fragment, long overlooked, describes a place where the sun burned hotter than in Greenland and where vines grew wild. Grapes don't grow naturally in Newfoundland's cold climate, but they thrive in areas of Nova Scotia and Maine. Perhaps the Vinland of legend wasn't a single location. Maybe it was a network of seasonal camps stretching down the Atlantic coast, small outposts that came and went, their traces slowly erased by time and forest. In 2021, researchers analyzing ancient DNA samples from Icelandic families discovered something startling. A small fraction of Icelanders, less than 1%, carry a genetic signature most commonly found among Native American populations. At first, scientists thought it might be an anomaly, but the DNA dated back to around 1000 CE, exactly when Norse explorers were known to be voyaging westward. The only logical conclusion, some interaction, perhaps even intermarriage, between Norse explorers and indigenous peoples. It's a small clue, but one that adds human depth to the story. History books often frame these encounters as conflict, yet genetic evidence hints at something more complex: relationships, cultural exchange, and families born of 2 worlds. There's even speculation that some Norse families brought people back from Vinland to Greenland or Iceland, though whether willingly or as slaves remains uncertain. If true, this means the Americas had already influenced Europe in subtle, unrecorded ways long before Columbus's time. In Newport, Rhode Island, stands an odd stone structure, the Newport Tower. Built from rough stones and mortar, it's circular with arched openings, unlike typical colonial architecture. For decades, historians credited it to 17th century English settlers, but some researchers, like Frederick Pohl and others in the early 20th century, argued it was far older, perhaps a Norse church or watchtower. They noted its uncanny resemblance to round churches found in medieval Scandinavia, such as those on the island of Bornholm. Others pointed to early maps that seemed to depict North America long before Columbus. The Vinland map, allegedly drawn in the 15th century, but possibly older, shows a landmass west of Greenland labeled Vinlanda Insula. While debates rage over its authenticity, its mere existence fuels speculation that knowledge of America circulated quietly in Europe, centuries before it was officially discovered. Maybe those who knew kept it secret, traders, explorers, or even monks who guarded the information for spiritual or political reasons. After all, a world where Scandinavians had already crossed the Atlantic would have rewritten the entire European narrative of exploration and conquest. By the 1300s, Greenland's Norse colonies began to vanish. The Little Ice Age tightened its grip, trade routes froze, and communication with Europe dwindled. When ships later returned, they found only ruins, empty halls, broken churches, and scattered bones. No one knows exactly what happened. Some theories suggest disease or starvation. Others whisper of assimilation, that survivors intermarried with local Inuit peoples, adopting new ways of life. If the last Greenlanders had ever known of Vinland, that knowledge likely died with them. Written records were few, and oral traditions faded as generations passed. By the time Columbus sailed west, the memory of Norse America had become myth, a story told by firelight, doubted even by those who heard it. But faint traces linger. Inuit stories describe encounters with tall, pale visitors who came from the east in great wooden ships. They spoke strange languages and traded iron for furs. These oral histories were passed down for centuries before any European returned to those shores. Could these be echoes of the Vikings, real people whose journeys were forgotten by one world but remembered by another? In 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Engstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Engstad made the discovery that changed everything. Guided by old maps and local folklore, they arrived at a small site on Newfoundland's north tip called Lanse Meadows. There, beneath peat and grass, they uncovered unmistakable Norse longhouse remains, iron nails, spindle whorls, and turf walls identical to those in Icelandic settlements. Carbon dating confirmed their age, around 1000 CE. For the first time, the sagas were proven real. The Vikings had indeed reached North America, centuries before Columbus. The discovery forced historians to rewrite a major chapter of human history. Yet for all its significance, Lanse Meadows may have been just one small part of a much larger story. The site's short occupation suggested it was a temporary base, a gateway to further exploration southward. What happened beyond that point remains the great mystery. Even today, the academic community is divided. Traditional historians argue there's insufficient evidence to support a large Norse presence beyond Newfoundland, but others, independent researchers, archaeologists, even geologists, insist that absence of proof isn't proof of absence. Satellite imaging has begun revealing anomalies along the Atlantic coast, rectangular formations beneath the soil, strange alignments consistent with Norse building styles. In 2016, one such site at Point Rose, Newfoundland, sparked global excitement as potential new Viking ruins. Although later studies were inconclusive, it rekindled the search. The fascination endures because the question isn't just about who came first, it's about how history is written and who gets to write it. If the Vikings truly mapped parts of America, it would mean that the accepted timeline of exploration is incomplete, that our textbooks reflect not the whole truth, but a curated version shaped by later politics and pride. Interestingly, traces of Norse mythology seeped into American folklore long before modern discoveries. In the 19th century, Scandinavian immigrants in the Midwest told stories of ancient explorers who had walked those lands centuries before. Some even claimed to have unearthed strange tools or stones with runes near riverbanks and lakes. The very spirit of rugged independence and exploration that shaped early American identity carries a faint Viking undertone: courage, discovery, the call of the unknown. In Minnesota, towns like Leif Erikson Park and statues honoring Norse explorers stand as reminders that this story still captivates the American imagination. Even the U.S. Congress officially recognized Leif Erikson Day on October 9th, celebrating the Norse arrival in North America, quietly acknowledging that Columbus wasn't the first European to set foot here. In the end, what remains of the Viking voyages to America isn't just about stones or artifacts, it's about memory. History often forgets not because events didn't happen, but because they didn't fit the narrative that later civilizations wanted to tell. The Vikings were never conquerors on American soil. They didn't build empires or leave monuments. They came, saw, and returned, leaving behind whispers instead of records. Yet their story resonates precisely because of that mystery. Somewhere in the forests of Maine or the rocky shores of Nova Scotia, fragments of that lost chapter may still lie hidden, buried under centuries of silence, waiting for another curious explorer to uncover them. And when that happens, the world may finally admit that the first Europeans to gaze upon American shores didn't sail under the Spanish flag, but beneath the red and white banner of the Norsemen, carried by winds from 1,000 years ago. They came with the sea at their backs and the unknown before them. They built homes, traded stories, and vanished into time's long shadow. But the truth doesn't disappear, it waits. Every rune carved into stone, every legend told by firelight, is a reminder that history is larger than we're taught to believe. So the next time you stand on a North American coast and stare out at the endless Atlantic, imagine the shape of a dragon-headed ship gliding toward you, its sails full, its warriors watching the horizon. Because maybe they were here long before we ever knew it.